A welcome back to our listeners and viewers of the Responsible Edge podcast, brought to you by the Andrew Greenwash Charter. This week, I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by Jack Cunningham. Jack, thank you so much for giving up some of your time this very bright Thursday afternoon.
You're welcome, Charlie. Great to be here. Thank you.
Now, Jack, you and I met, it feels like some time ago now, but probably quite a lot has just happened since you and I have met. So it feels like things have gone through fairly quickly. And obviously when I first met you, I was amazed to hear about all the sort of brilliant work that you've done over the course of your kind of career today. Now, for those of our listeners and viewers who aren't aware of you and your background, we've got kind of 20 minutes or so to introduce them to you. But in particular, looking through the lens of kind of corporate ethics, responsibility and sustainability, I'd like to sort of tell your story, if you like. But let's start, if possible, by going right back to the beginning. And I'd love to sort of hear about perhaps some of those kind of formative experiences as a child or into adolescence, perhaps even early part of your career, that have really helped shape your view of the world.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Well, we'll have to go a fair while back, but certainly there were certainly some pivotal moments in that time leading up to kind of entering the world of work more formally. I've always, been someone that's enjoyed being outdoors and in nature, and as a family, we always spent a lot of time outdoors, walking and doing outdoor activities. I was very fortunate enough to spend part of my childhood living in the Peak District. So, I grew to love being outdoors and watching wildlife and participating in kind of activities outdoors all the time. So that's one thing I think.
And Jack, sorry to interrupt you, but for those of our listeners, and especially our US listeners who are a growing demographic, I have to say, listening into the show, what describe the Peak District to us?
The Peak District is a national park in the UK. It's was one of the first established areas in the UK deemed access or given access to the public. Mm-hmm. And it's the most visited national park in the United Kingdom. It's right in the center of the United Kingdom, so it's very accessible to almost everybody within England in particular. It sits between major conurbations like Sheffield and Manchester. It's very easily reached from London, and it's a beautiful blend of limestone, gritstone, incredible different landscapes and communities. It's the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom. So there's a huge history there, not just in terms of the landscape and the and nature, but also the communities that have been so important to the development of the UK over many, many years. So it's one of a number of national parks. It just happens to be, a very famous one. And like I said, the most visited national park in the UK.
And brilliantly described. I mean, I wasn't going to throw at you that you needed to become a travel guide or tour operator, but for any of our US listeners that are listening in, Jack has done a brilliant job there of describing how beautiful it is. So you're a young lad. You've experienced this wonderful outdoors. You've got a real affinity with the wildlife and nature that's around you. What influence does that play on your decision making throughout?
Well, I suppose like many people who've gone into the sustainability world or conservation, I was sort of very influenced by David Attenborough programs, on the BBC. So, British naturalists, broadcaster, obviously kind of living legend in the UK and national treasure. I initially thought I wanted to go into the conservation space and dedicate my life to working in conservation. And I built on that desire by doing a 3-month project in my gap year before university in Tanzania, working on coral reef conservation. So I was already starting to think about how I might pursue a career in conservation. I was also doing local volunteering, near Oxford, where I grew up, with the local wildlife trust. So I was starting to kind of build a persona for myself, I suppose, that this would be something I'd want to do full time. But equally, I wasn't sure, I wasn't sure there was really a career in it, how long it would take and so forth. So that was another key moment, that sort of post GCSE and A-level before university period of my life, where I was starting to think more seriously about going into the, into the natural world as a profession.
But you were, but you were very much acting upon that. You were a young person. We hear so many young people that, find themselves slightly directionless, and, perhaps it's not clear about what they want to do next. But for you, it was perhaps not in conservation ultimately, but you knew that, your passion and enthusiasm for the natural world and being involved in some way in preserving it, that was something that was pretty evident from the beginning. Is that a fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sort of aligned to that, I was starting to read quite a lot in the newspapers about environmental issues in particular. I was taking an interest in how these things were being reported in the kind of mid-90s. My parents used to subscribe to a magazine, a very left-wing magazine called The New Internationalist, which was very focused on highlighting issues related to human rights, environmental issues. And there was always a section in that magazine which spotlit kind of corporate bad behavior in relation to human rights and environmental issues. And I found it very interesting that they were sort of taking those issues through the lens of companies and what companies were doing and how companies were both doing bad things, but also trying to rectify their mistakes. And that definitely sowed the seed for me in terms of thinking, well, maybe there's something in that. Maybe there is a future where all companies will have to be accountable for their behavior and the harm they're doing, whether it's pollution or health and safety incidences or what have you. And that was really where I brought those two interests together and started thinking longer term, sort of post university, about how I might get into something that was before really corporate sustainability was a fully formed sector. And largely that sort of work was done by the major extractives and the major sort of heavy industry businesses. But again, that was another sort of formative time, being exposed to that type of reporting and that type of awareness raising by the media to get me interested.
And you sort of had identified your, as you I'm going to regurgitate what you said and probably do so far less eloquently, but you had identified your route to having, to combining, as you say, those two areas of interest. What did you do at university?
So I studied zoology. So really, as a result of doing this marine conservation project in Tanzania, I knew that I'd always, biology was my favorite science. I knew I wanted to do something related to that. So I went to Leeds to study zoology, which was a very well-known faculty, particularly in the field of ecology, biomechanics, and so that's the movement of animals, and other sorts of reproductive and ecological strategies that animals in the animal kingdom deploy in terms of how they exist and coexist with other species. So that was really kind of where I got to at the sort of formal education stage. And then I met someone through friends of a friend who had done a master's at Imperial College. She had then subsequently gone on to work for Shell as an ecologist. And I thought, well, this is interesting. My kind of hunch around companies employing people to help them with this stuff seems to be a real thing. And she'd done this master's at Imperial, which, to this day is considered to be one of the most important postgrad degrees out there. And I decided to do the same one. And kind of that then got me the foot in the door, so to speak, to kind of take my initial hunch into a professional realm.
And just Jack, sorry, you might have already said this, but that master's was in ecology. Did you?
No, so it was called, it's still called Environmental Technology. It's the MSc in Environmental Technology at Imperial College London. It's a broad-based, a sort of MBA for people in the sustainability field. And at the time, I couldn't say now, I sort of lost touch with it, but they broke the masters up into 5 or 6 specific angles to the sustainability. It wasn't even called sustainability. Mainly environmental policy type world. And one was pollution management. There was one on health. There was one on business in the environment. There was one on ecology. I chose the pollution management specialism because I was really interested in how big, heavy industry was starting to kind of really be affected by European policy and what kinds of technologies they would have to invest in and lean on in order to clean themselves up. So, I think we would do case studies on things like British Steel in Scunthorpe and Port Talbot, which of course we've heard a lot about recently. But you'd have to kind of base a lot of your studies and your policy research on these real life examples of industry that were going through these changes. So an absolutely critical bit of education for me, and it's one that's still going. It's still a very important research discipline for many people entering the sustainability space.
I'm inclined, I've got so many questions that I could continue to ask you, but I'm wary that I've got a lot more career to go through. So I'm going to allow you now to take us forward from here, and perhaps I'll ask those other questions another time. But Jack, what happens post your master's?
Well, so I was, again, very fortunately from that degree, and thanks to the degree course leader, sadly now no longer with us, Professor Nigel Bell, and a man with incredible network, incredible knowledge of all his students. He could remember every single student going way back to the late 70s who had participated, where they'd ended up, what companies they were working for, what organizations. And he was a brilliant networker. So I was fortunate through him to get a job in consulting at a place called AEA Technology, which was a now defunct consultancy practice that specialized in public policy, environmental policy, mainly for the UK government, but some work for the EU government as well. So I spent the first 6 years working for them and for eventually for a competitor, mostly on industrial emissions policy. So the early stages of what we know as the emissions trading scheme in the EU and various other heavy industry policies that were affecting the UK industrial sectors. But I knew I wasn't super technical. I wanted to do what my hunch was telling me, which is about companies and what companies would do themselves. And so really from there on, I've worked in-house as a senior sustainability leader in well-known publicly listed companies like ITV, Sainsbury's, Marks and Spencer, Kingfisher. I've also spent nearly 8 years in the mining industry with a company called Gemfields, which specializes in colored gemstones. I've led consulting practice for PwC in Southeast Asia for a couple of years. And now I'm freelancing. So I'm kind of out there as a bit of a gun for hire, working with clients who are seeking advice or maybe some more technical services and support for what they're doing.
Now, Jack, you have brilliantly nutshelled such a significant and varied in terms of sector, etc. career into such a nice little nutshell. I'm going to ask you though, that hunch that the young Jack had, if you like, that there was going to be this opportunity to work within companies to deliver this. When you think about what you expected as a younger man for that role, like, and the impact that you were likely to have within that role, how has the lived experience married up to the expectations of the university grad Jack, thinking about what you thought you might do?
I mean, I think in many ways it's sort of borne out what I thought it would be. I remember when I was at Imperial, we would have people like me coming back and doing lectures. And slightly embarrassingly and shamefully, that one person, not the friend that I met at Shell, but somebody else who worked at Shell in the strategy team, the sort of scenario strategy team. So this is a team that was developed to sort of look forward at what Shell might do, particularly from a renewable energy investment perspective, and horizon scan what the future of oil and gas might be. We ended up booing her, actually, because we felt that she had sold out. But actually, you know, what I reflect on now is just the importance of working within companies and the challenges that are faced, actually. Particularly what she said was, look, I'm the lone voice almost within the strategy team, a sort of Trojan horse, if you like, advocating for better practice and trying to get people to listen. And I don't think we were particularly kind to her, you know, which wasn't nice. But I think in many ways, in the early stage of my career, it was a lot easier because the rules and the roles were more were less well defined. Whereas now, of course, we have greater amounts of regulation, greater scrutiny, greater awareness, greater understanding of the importance that companies have in striving for better practices and governance and ethics. But it has become as difficult as I imagine she felt it was when she came to speak to us in 2001. So very, very much kind of as I thought it would be. And, you know, I'm still absolutely passionate about the importance of people working within companies to affect that change. It certainly has become a lot harder than it was when I started out.
That's fascinating. To see how as you suggested, the rules have tightened, if you like, and the parameters in which you can operate within these roles has just got you know, you say more stringent, if you like. Jack, let me ask you one more question about you before we move on to this week's article. When you think about the rest of your career, I want to get a crystal ball out here, so feel free. Magic wands and crystal balls on this show. When you think about the rest of your career, what would success look like?
Oh, the classic question. Gosh, I think it would, you know, for me, success is really where, as a practitioner inside a company, it would be seeing senior decision makers, and by that I mean the ExCom or the board, properly embrace and embed sustainability and decision making related to sustainability alongside the main strategic decisions that they make, as you know, as and for the company on behalf of all their stakeholders. So not paying lip service to it, obviously, not just kind of incorporating it as something that is required because regulation demands it, but because they fundamentally understand that to be a properly sustainable company and a properly responsible company requires that strategic mindset to incorporate all the difficulties and complexities and trade-offs related to sustainability alongside those commercial decisions that they make every day without thinking too much about it. And that for me would be true success. I've seen elements of that many times. I've seen glimpses of that. I've seen brilliant leaders single-mindedly make decisions that have been, for all the right reasons, in a very balanced, commercial and ethical and sustainable way. But I think for me to see that happen across an organization in a consistent way, without there being a backtracking for whatever reason, that would be, you know, true success for me, I think.
And I mean, yeah, a brilliant sort of horizon, if you like, to work towards. What would be your, and again, this is a difficult question to answer, I appreciate this, and we are talking generalizations here, but what would be your kind of scorecard, if you like, if you were to reflect on, obviously you've worked in some very large organizations, you've worked alongside leadership in those organizations and understood attitudes towards sustainability. What would be your kind of report card of where you think we are as a sort of a state of play, if you like, in terms of the sustainability functions within these large companies? Are we heading in the right direction, is my question.
If you'd asked me 6 months ago or even a year ago, I would probably have landed on the side of yes, not through any fault of the functions themselves. I hasten to add. Right now, I think we're in a little bit of a crisis with regards to in-house functions. I think that certainly what's happened in the US since last November has made things much more difficult. The UK leaving the EU has made things more difficult if you're a UK practitioner. And the EU itself has not helped in creating regulations that are hugely complex and difficult to understand for most people. And that means that we're all under immense pressure to deliver vastly complicated things across multiple departments, usually with totally under-resourced teams, and still expected to be both crystal ball mind readers, functional experts, accountants, legal gurus, literally everything under the sun. So I don't think it's a reflection on the brilliant people who work in this sector and continue to be attracted to it. But I think a lot of people that I know are feeling fairly worn down by it, and are struggling to see, feel optimistic about the future, particularly when, even today we're hearing from the Trump administration about its feelings around climate and so forth. Obviously, the DEI piece over there as well has sort of thrown a bit of a spanner in the works. So not great, but I remain faithful and committed, and hope that many of my contemporaries do as well.
I love that, Jack. I was going to conclude with just asking you outright how optimistic you are, more generally, but I think you've kind of covered that off. It's fascinating. But let's move forward now, though. I'm inclined to, I could ask you loads more questions about you, but let's move forward with this week's article. Would you mind possibly providing a bit of a summary, a bit of an introduction, if you like, to, I think it was Eleanor Hawkins' piece in Axios in September last year? Would you mind providing a bit of an overview, Jack, and then just pick for you whatever the most interesting points were from the piece?
Yeah, sure. So the article is called "How Companies Are Shifting to Smarter, Subtle Messaging on ESG." And it's interesting because the article was written pre the US election. So it references the fact that the election is upcoming, but sort of stopped short of making any predictions about what the outcome might be or what that impact might have on companies and how they think about and talk about sustainability or ESG and how that's messaged. What it does do, I think, is kind of it does kind of provide a little bit of a crystal ball in terms of companies that have maybe tried to reflect broader societal changes, broader societal shifts in policy and expectation. Certainly in the US, I would say that companies taking on the kind of the guise of being quite activist and showcasing themselves to be reflective of latest progressive ideas around social, environmental issues. And really the discussion with representatives from Danone and from Ralph Lauren and from Weber Shandwick talk about companies starting to pivot away from that. So, what we might think of as green hushing, or just taking a bit more time to be reflective of what they are as a company, what they should be saying and why. I think, what's clear is that those three companies all say, look, we should be much more clear about our purpose as businesses firstly, rather than just jumping on the latest trend, or simply because we've asked to fill out a survey or because we've asked to sign up to this pledge that we should immediately do it without thinking. We should be a little bit more circumspect as to why we're doing that and whether it's suitable and fits with the brand. And the conclusions are, we have to serve our own customers first. We have to serve our brand purpose first before, jumping on those bandwagons. And I think the other thing that's quite interesting about it is that they are alluding to this idea of green hushing, but excuse me, but not in the sense that we think about it, where critics of green hushing might say, well, the reason why these companies aren't talking about what they're doing is because they don't want to talk about it, and actually they're not talking about it because they're not doing anything. And the piece argues, well, look, just because we might not be talking so overtly about DE&I issues or using that language so clearly doesn't mean we're not still undertaking the work within the company to progress things more forward, which I would certainly agree with. So it's a sort of interesting inflection point. I'm sure we'll get on to talking about this in more detail in regards to your own work, Charlie. How and when do companies decide to speak? What do they say? How do they say it? And so forth. So it's an interesting. It's not a long article, but it's an interesting glimpse into kind of how these big brands might be thinking about prioritizing their messaging and making sure that they can continue to translate difficult subjects in a sort of succinct and simple way for their audiences.
Now, we've had 135 previous summaries and synopses of articles provided by guests, and I have to say, Jack, I think that's as good as we've had. Absolutely brilliant. But anyone,
I'm sure that's what you say to all your guests, Charlie. But thank you. I'll take the compliment.
You can listen through the rest, where no one needs to put themselves through that. But no, it's very, very good. For anyone that wants to check out the original source article, though, we'll obviously link to the piece for you guys to go and check out. But Jack has really nailed that as an introduction. Jack, you mentioned when summarizing that about the fact that it was obviously published in September last year, and it kind of alludes to the upcoming election, but obviously wasn't necessarily obviously factoring in exactly what the kind of circumstances that we find ourselves in. How have things changed? Sitting and reflecting on things now in April 2025, what's in this article would you suggest if author was revisiting it, like what would be the fundamental shifts or differences in the way that they presented things in this piece now that we know?
Well, I think it's probably borne out. I mean, there's obviously been a huge amount of scrutiny and reporting on companies not rowing back from, because I would be hesitant to say they were doing that. But certainly, there's lots of evidence that companies have removed the language associated with diversity, equality, and inclusion within their sustainability programs or their corporate reporting or their websites. Now, clearly, this is predominantly a political reaction to the administration, and but I don't believe that any sensible company would actually be rolling back their DE&I programs. That being said, I haven't worked for a US company before, although I know lots of people in the US. I'm yet to really find out whether what the actual truth is as a result of the administration and its sort of pronouncement. I think the other thing that has been clear is that sort of in the investment and banking community in the US, there is definitely a recalibration and a rethink around what does ESG mean for that sector. how do investors really price in and value companies they're investing in terms of those ESG and sustainability programs that they are factoring into their fund making decisions. We've seen a reduction or a complete step away from the Net Zero Banking Alliance, I think it's called, in the US. So, there is inevitable actual impact that's occurred since that article was written, which I think will have a cascading effect on other sectors and potentially the work that people like myself do within companies. And certainly the arguments will become potentially harder to make, particularly if, these issues have become politicized. Inevitably, companies are made up of not just workers and employees and leaders and executives, but those people themselves are voters who are political. And everyone's right to and entitled to their own political views. But I think that's where it becomes quite worrying, and will be very interesting to see what happens now that the sort of the anti-woke so-called lobby have really started to sink their teeth into things that we hitherto thought were generally accepted business practices.
Scary, but brilliantly explained. Let me ask you this. You alluded to there about, the fact that in your experience, and I have to say from mine, speaking to, the organizations that we talk to, there is a sense that although we might not be speaking so openly about the initiatives that are at play, it doesn't mean that things have stopped in terms of the implementation of some of these sustainability or ESG initiatives. What are the implications, though, Jack, if we all collectively stop talking about what we're doing? What impact does that have?
Well, I think it depends who's doing the talking and who's stopping that talking and who's doing the listening and is unable to listen, I suppose. I think if you're inside a company doing the do, and you feel that you should dial down what you're communicating for various reasons, I think it's inevitably quite demoralizing. Because you're largely many of us are still largely relevant and want to be relevant in order to be relevant, rather, showcase the stuff we've done. It's simple as that, really. I think there are not many regular places for people working in sustainability to kind of get their stories out there in a balanced way. And I think if you're, for whatever reason, whether it's pressure from cynical stakeholders who question everything you say, or whether it's because of political pressure, not being able to say something can be heartbreaking, I think. And I've worked with people, brilliant people in different sectors, in different companies, who working on very, very niche sustainability issues, topics, projects, want to get their story across and we might choose not to, or it may not be the right time, or there may not be enough of a story there to make it newsworthy or gain interest. So I think it could be quite demoralizing. I think to my earlier point about the regulations, certainly the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive has made things a lot more simple in many ways, because it has required companies to think about their own materiality and therefore collect data that is most meaningful for them and then report that. But I worry that the kind of rich narratives around these projects and initiatives will somehow get lost because they don't deliver a data point for that regulation. So there's another sort of layer to that. I think on the listening side, I guess it potentially it kind of expedites this concern amongst people who think that greenwashing is happening because companies are just going to dial back on their commitments. maybe people will start doubling down, and it will just further fuel this cynicism that companies are not doing anything or are not saying anything because they've got something to hide. And I think that probably isn't the case. I largely believe that people working in sustainability alongside marketing and communications colleagues are generally trying to do the right thing. And I think we've talked about this before, Charlie. There's not a cabal of shadowy marketeers and sustainability people sitting in a room cooking up the next idea for how to fleece people. So again, I think if we stop talking, it will put further pressure on companies to talk. It will require companies to be even more smart and accurate about what they do say. And it's a kind of vicious circle, I think.
And you position that brilliantly, Jack. Let me throw something that plagues me when I think about us all shutting up, essentially, and not sharing the news, if you like. Like, we presumably, the kind of peer-to-peer learning that occurs as a result of sharing what we're doing, what's being impactful, what's worked, what hasn't. I've had conversations on this show a lot with people talking about partnership, talking about collaboration, talking about the fact that we've got to come together. Well, if we don't talk about the stuff that's working and the stuff that's not working, how on earth are we going to learn from one another in order to stimulate the kind of innovation and the kind of adoption that's required? Do you share that concern that we really have got to find a way of being able to communicate about these things in order to learn collectively?
I don't know if I share that concern in the same way, because I think collaboration will continue to happen and is absolutely critical. It's extremely difficult, let's not forget, to get companies to collaborate in particular, for various reasons. I think one of the challenges is that many of the biggest, certainly environmental challenges, if you were to take, for instance, Scope 3 emissions reduction in a supply chain, any supply chain activity where you've got more than one or two tiers of supplier requires multiple companies to collaborate. You can only do that by talking. I don't think that will be affected purely because of some of the factors we've been talking about. I think there's always been a challenge with talking and then collaborating in a meaningful sense, because it's just very, very difficult to do. It's difficult enough to just do it within one company, let alone multiple companies. And, there have been some really great efforts, and there are many examples of this, whether it's through multi-stakeholder initiatives or trade bodies incentivizing, encouraging their members to get behind certain initiatives. There's lots of examples. So I can't see a world where that will stop. But I think it's more, when I think about what we're talking about in terms of communications and stories and messaging, it's more how a company itself tells its own stories about its progress. And who the audience is. Are they talking to an echo chamber of people like me, or are they really talking to their customers? Whilst we have lots of data to show that, broadly speaking, most people understand the importance of climate change, are concerned about it, want to see action, so on and so forth, the say-do gap, as we know, is very large. And whilst customers might want to hear that a company is doing all this great stuff for the environment, for society, and so on, whether they're then prepared to pay a premium on product is another matter. So, that for me is where my concern is. We need to encourage better decision-making by consumers. We need to encourage them to adopt more care and concern for the products and the sourcing of those products and the supply chains. We can only really do that if we talk and engage and communicate. And so that would be, that's where my concern comes in, is how does it translate into behavior change and narrowing of that say-do gap that we know exists.
And that brilliantly segues me into a question that I want to pick up on a point that you made earlier about brands associating themselves with multiple opportunities for activism, if you like, and that almost we went through a phase where it was, well, whatever the flavor of the month is, let's align ourselves with that particular opportunity for brand alignment, if you like. Are you, in light of what you've just said about needing to think about, well, how is this communication actually going to lead to a change in behavior or an adoption of a new way of thinking, etc.? Are you thinking that we're about to move into a new phase where actually, brands are a little bit more intentional and purposeful about aligning with only those activist opportunities that really do align with the key message they're trying to deliver? Do you think we're entering a new kind of a new dawn, if you like, in terms of how brands align themselves with?
I would hope so. It's a complicated one. I think so. Where I think brands have done this well is in the creation of networks for their employees, particularly from a DE&I perspective. Now, lots of cynics will say, well, this is kind of, this is sort of identity washing. It's, you're just creating a DE&I program and a network for the sake of it. Well, no, actually. Companies do it because their employees ask them to do it, and they want a space where they can talk about and represent their particular interest or issue safely with the support of their colleagues, their leaders, and the company facilitates that. Pretty much every big company I've worked for in recent times has had multiple networks, programs for allyship that encourage people from outside those identities to participate and champion and get involved. So I think that's one area that companies have embraced and done really well at. I think where it becomes difficult, and I think this is possibly less so in the UK and Europe, somewhat more so in Europe, maybe mainland Europe than the UK, certainly in the US, is kind of the more activist CEO, NGO type of behavior. And that's, I think, where we're moving away a little bit from that. You kind of think of Paul Polman, of course, as the sort of standard bearer for progressive CEO behavior and really championing Unilever's sustainable living plan and all the stuff it was doing to kind of position the business as, as all things to all people. And, unfortunately, the investors didn't like that ultimately. And I think, we're seeing that happen more and more. So I wonder whether that will mean a bit more circumspect about what companies commit to, how far they're willing to go, particularly because a lot of the stuff that companies are asked to sign up to and commit to, again, utterly complex, very difficult to achieve, probably uncosted. And I think, there needs to be a little bit more pragmatism and seriousness about what the company is going to be able to do before it's, says what it's going to do and communicates as such. That being said, I don't see any time soon where companies don't, at least internally, have those debates and constantly question, should we be celebrating this thing? Should we be championing this issue? What's our position statement on that? Do we have a point of view? Is it really material to our business to even be talking about that? Those debates happen all the time.
And it's encouraging to hear that that's the case, I think, because, or that is, your experience of that, because I think from an outsider's perspective, perhaps looking in at big brands and big business and perhaps at times thinking it looks like there's just a jumping from whatever the flavor of the month is to the next thing to try and align and get the brand awareness piece around. Well, if there is a little bit more concern and consideration that's going into exactly what brands choose to align themselves with, I think that will create a more sort of a less diluted understanding and appreciation of some of these issues, because I think that's one of the unavoidable consequences, I think, of everybody jumping on these issues at play, is that you end up actually diluting the issue itself in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I think we also have to acknowledge that companies are not the originator of a lot of these concepts, right? Mm-hmm. Companies are reactive for various reasons. It could be a commercial opportunity. It could be a reputational risk mitigation exercise. It could be peer group pressure. It could be employee pressure. It could be investor pressure. It could be NGO pressure. A lot of the things that companies having to grapple with are come about as a result of an ecosystem of things. And if the company doesn't sort of participate in that narrative or that dialogue, it's left outside. It's sort of it stands up as an outlier in the discourse. So let's give an example. Regenerative agriculture, right? There's no definition for what regenerative agriculture actually means, but was it a company or companies that started talking about that first? Right. Was it NGOs that sort of defined it and started pushing companies to think more holistically about their agricultural sourcing and management practices? Where did this term originate from, and why is it now the common description for a in quotes better way of doing agriculture? So I think we have to, on both sides, companies have to be careful to not jump on the bandwagon before they really understand themselves or define for themselves what they understand these things to mean. But equally, they are somewhat reactive to advisors, NGOs, critical friends saying, well, there's the latest research into this thing is something that you need to be thinking about. What are you doing? It's a kind of chicken and egg situation. It's a virtuous circle almost. And yeah, look, companies are within sectors are generally act kind of with the herd. You kind of sometimes have those companies that lead from the front and provide the kind of path forward for the sector.
Yeah.
Most companies are risk averse and wait to see what the policy says or how the landscape lies before committing to a certain course of action. And if everybody's moving in that direction, of course, companies will move as well. So I think we just need to be a bit more nuanced about how companies sign up to these types of trends, if you want to call them that.
And that was going to be my concluding point on that, is the key to listening well and being nuanced and intentional about alignment with particular issues. I think that's coming through loud and clear. Jack, as you can see, we've absolutely obliterated our times together as expected. Let me conclude now with the magic wand question. Jack, if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
If I would wish my colleagues and contemporaries to have the resources and the budgets, the buy-in, all the things that those of us who've been doing this for a long, long time have been saying is needed. I would really love to see the same level of care and attention given to sustainability teams and the delivery of their programs, the support they're given from senior leadership, as most other departments do. I liken sustainability as a kind of Swiss Army knife. It does a little bit of everything, but unfortunately, it always seems to be the department or activity that kind of gets its legs chopped off at the earliest opportunity, and it cannot continue that way. It has to be properly integrated into every department's activity in a way that we really have seen attempts at over the years, but I still don't think we're really anywhere close to it being systemic. And that can only come from providing the tools and the budgets and the people and the support and leadership to it that enables that sort of ecosystem to really thrive within the company. And that will then support the kind of, the better alignment with corporate strategy, but the better delivery, the better impact, the ability to measure more coherently and accurately, and hopefully, starts to kind of round off some of the edges around the cynicism that is there, which most sustainability people have to face into, rightly so, because, the corporate sector gets things wrong a lot of the time, and for very good reason, it should be criticized. But, largely speaking, we are there to try and help companies be better. We're genuinely trying to make a change, but I think that would be my magic wand, is to sort of provide that support more to those wonderful teams and wonderful people kind of still fighting the good fight.
And Jack, you're going to get your first hear of the show. I am out here's people that I think nail it. You described it so beautifully, but I'm going to regurgitate it in a very, very simple and blunt form. It's just, give us the tools and resources that we need in order to prove that investment in these initiatives, in these areas, leads to the kind of commercial realities and returns that everybody's looking for. Give us the opportunity, though. That's the key remark, isn't it? That the under-resourced, you won't realize what's really the opportunity at play here. Is that
absolutely
fair?
Absolutely, yeah. Well said.
Jack, it's been a delight. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's been great to have you on the show. I know it's a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully we might snaffle you for another show in the future where we can dive into another interesting I'd
be delighted, Charlie. Yeah, thanks for having me.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A huge thank you to Jack Cunningham, sustainability strategist and, amongst other things, former head of ESG at M&S, for joining me for today's show. In this episode, we explored the mounting pressures on companies to communicate ESG strategies with greater clarity and conviction. And it was a particularly interesting episode in light of what's going on in the geopolitical landscape. As a reminder, this show was brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter, championing responsible sustainability communications. Visit antigreenwashcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.